The yellow streetlights at Ardan Fair Mall flickered against the damp asphalt, casting long shadows across rows of empty cars. It was November 2007, a cool Sacramento night that should have ended with nothing more than teenage laughter and tired feet after the homecoming dance. Instead, it became the beginning of a nightmare. 17-year-old Madison Clark sat in the passenger seat of her boyfriend's silver Corolla, emerald dress gathered at her knees, silver necklace catching the faint light. For a moment, everything felt safe, soft giggles, whispered dreams of college, the casual comfort of youth. Then, footsteps, slow, echoing across the lot. You've heard those footsteps before, haven't you? In a lonely parking structure, on a dim street where you quicken your pace and hope they're not closing in. A tall, thin figure appeared in the rearview mirror. A shiny jacket caught the glow, a baseball cap pulled low. Before Madison could scream, the door was wrenched open. A hand. A punch. Tyler Brooks slumped unconscious, and Madison was dragged into the darkness. All that remained was a cigarette butt smoldering on the ground, an empty beer can, and shoe prints dissolving into shadow. Within hours, Sacramento would awaken to a city on edge, a family in pieces, and a police force chasing a ghost. For 13 years, there would be vigils, rumors, suspects, and silence. Only science, years later, would unseal the box marked cold case files and whisper the name of a neighbor no one suspected. What happened under those yellow lamps is more than a story of loss. It's a reminder that monsters don't always wear masks. Sometimes they wave from across the street. Stay with us. Subscribe now, and let's walk together through one of the most haunting cold case files ever reopened, because the truth deserves the light. The night had begun like countless other high school memories, woven with music, teenage anticipation, and the feeling that the future was waiting just beyond the edge of the dance floor. Rio Americano, high school's auditorium glowed with colorful lights, music pulsing through its walls as students celebrated their homecoming dance. Madison Clark, 17, glided across the floor in her emerald dress, the silver heart necklace at her chest catching beams of blue and red. She danced with friends, laughed with Tyler Brooks, and posed for photos that would later become both treasures and wounds. For 3 hours, her world was ordinary, perfect in the fleeting way of adolescence. Soda cups clinked. Camera flashes preserved youth. Dreams were spoken without hesitation, college in a bigger city, careers that sounded grand when whispered between songs. Madison's radiant smile was proof of how deeply she believed in tomorrow. When the music faded and the crowd began to thin, Madison and Tyler slipped into the cool Sacramento air. They could have driven straight home, but like so many teenagers reluctant to let the night end, they steered instead toward Ardan Fair Mall. The vast parking lot stretched empty under the halo of yellow lamps, a place both public and eerily private. Tyler parked in one of the shadowed corners, where the streetlights bled just enough light to frame the silver Corolla. Inside, Madison kicked off her high heels, wiggling her sore toes, and leaned against Tyler's shoulder. They talked in the soft, wandering way of two people who thought the night belonged entirely to them, about college applications, about inside jokes, about leaving Sacramento someday. Madison's laughter lingered, the kind of sound that made parents in the audience of a school dance look at each other and whisper, "She's going to be fine." But time, in moments like these, is fragile. What feels like permanence is only seconds away from breaking. Footsteps echoed across the pavement. Slow at first, then steadier, like a deliberate rhythm cutting through the silence. Tyler's eyes shifted to the rearview mirror. A tall figure moved toward them, thin, shoulders slightly hunched, a shiny jacket reflecting the yellow lamp's glow. A baseball cap shadowed the upper half of his face. Tyler's chest tightened. Madison noticed the change in his posture and turned her head, just as the shadow reached her side of the car. The passenger door wrenched open with a metallic crack. Madison gasped, her mouth forming the start of a scream, but a rough hand clamped onto her arm. Tyler lunged across the seat, grabbing her wrist, trying to pull her back. His knuckles brushed her necklace, the heart glinting once before the intruder's fist slammed into the side of his head. The pain was immediate and blinding. Tyler's temple collided with the doorframe, stars exploding in his vision. He tried to fight again, but a second blow collapsed his strength. The world tilted sideways, headlights in the distance smearing into streaks of color. For an instant, just before darkness swallowed him, he saw Madison dragged from the car, emerald fabric fluttering, heels scraping helplessly across the damp concrete. Her hand reached back, fingers outstretched, but the distance between them grew with every frantic step of the stranger, pulling her into the shadows. Then silence. When Tyler woke, the interior light of the Corolla cast a dim glow, turning the seat beside him into a hollow absence. Blood had dried along his temple, sticking to his hair. The passenger door hung open, rocking slightly in the night breeze. Madison was gone. On the ground outside, a cigarette butt smoldered faintly, ash clinging to the pavement. An empty beer can rolled slowly with the draft of air. Shoe prints, larger than Madison's delicate heels, trailed away into the darkness. Tyler's heart pounded with a mix of panic and disbelief. His trembling fingers searched the floorboard for his phone. When he found it, the screen smeared with blood. He fumbled with the buttons. His voice broke when the dispatcher answered. "Eights. My girlfriend, Madison Clark. She's been kidnapped. Someone took her right in front of me." "Eights!" The operator tried to calm him, urging him to stay at the scene until help arrived. But the words barely pierced the fog of shock. He clutched the phone to his ear as if it were the only tether keeping him from slipping into the abyss of what had just happened. Minutes later, the whine of sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights pierced the stillness of the lot, reflecting off the Corolla's metallic paint. Officers swarmed the car, pulling Tyler gently but firmly out of the seat. A paramedic pressed gauze against his wound, while detectives began marking the ground with evidence flags. They found the cigarette butt, the beer can, and, lodged in a crack of the pavement, a brass bullet casing. Each was photographed, bagged, and sealed. Nearby, shoe prints glistened in the dampness, plaster casts preserving their shapes. Forensics dusted the door handle, lifting a smudged print that might belong to someone other than Tyler or Madison. Inside the Corolla, Madison's silver purse lay untouched on the back seat. Her student ID was still inside, along with a few dollar bills. A pink Motorola phone, cracked but functional, blinked with its last text. "On my way. See you tomorrow." On the floor rested a metallic hair clip tangled with a few strands of brown curls. Everything spoke of sudden violence, not a runaway. But as Tyler repeated his account to police, the footsteps, the shiny jacket, the baseball cap, the assault, skepticism clouded their faces. One detective asked if he and Madison had argued. Another pressed whether alcohol was involved. Tyler's voice trembled, but he held to his story. He dragged her out. "I swear. I tried to stop him, but he hit me." Eights. Still, suspicion lingered. The only witness to the crime was also the boyfriend. And in the cold logic of investigation, that made him the first suspect. Outside the yellow tape, Richard and Elaine Clark arrived, their eyes wide with disbelief as they saw their daughter's empty car surrounded by flashing lights. Elaine clutched a framed photo Madison had taken hours earlier, sobbing uncontrollably. Richard's jaw tightened, rage and fear colliding in his veins as he demanded answers. But there were none. Not yet. What remained was a trail of fragments: cigarette, beer can, bullet casing, shoe prints, small pieces of a nightmare just beginning. For Tyler, the blow to his head was less brutal than the blow to his credibility. Trauma fragments memory, and when investigators detect hesitation or gaps, trust fractures. For Madison's parents, the sight of the Corolla without their daughter inside was the birth of a new reality. Life split into before and after. And for Sacramento, this was the spark of fear that would grow into a haunting. If this story already has you on edge, I want to hear from you. If you find videos like this meaningful, comment 1 below. If not, comment 0. Your feedback helps us bring more of these cold case files to light and keeps Madison's memory alive. The first 48 hours after a disappearance are always the most critical. Investigators know it, families feel it, and communities learn it in the worst possible ways. For Madison Clark, those hours began with flashing sirens in an empty parking lot and ended with a city already torn between hope and suspicion. At the scene, officers fanned out beneath the yellow glow of street lamps. Evidence markers dotted the ground: the cigarette butt, the dented beer can, the brass bullet casing pressed into a pavement crack. Photographers moved quickly, capturing the footprints before dampness could erode them. Inside the Corolla, Madison's purse and phone sat untouched, details that screamed interruption, not choice. The lingering scent of her perfume made the absence even sharper. Detectives pressed Tyler Brooks on every detail. He repeated the story: the footsteps, the man in the shiny jacket, the sudden blow, the green dress disappearing into darkness. But investigators have been trained to test the closest person first, and Tyler was that person. They circled back to the same questions. Did you and Madison argue? Did you lose your temper? Why is your blood the only blood inside the car? Tyler's voice cracked as he tried to defend himself. He swore again that he loved her, that he fought to hold on. But the suspicion in their eyes cut deeper than the wound on his temple. For him, the attack was only the beginning. Now he was battling the invisible weight of disbelief. In a sterile interrogation room, Tyler sat hunched under fluorescent lights that washed his face pale. An officer leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Tell it again." The demand wasn't curious. It was skeptical. Tyler's trembling hands twisted in his lap. He described the figure once more. Tall, thin, white, jacket reflective under the lamp, a cap pulled low. Each time he spoke, the memory replayed, fragments etched into his mind. Each time he was interrupted by doubt. You imagine that moment, don't you? Being struck hard enough to collapse, then waking up alone, only to be told your account doesn't add up. Truth suddenly feels flimsy, as though it needs proof you don't have. Meanwhile, Richard and Elaine Clark were brought to the station. They arrived around 1 a.m. Their faces hollow from the shock of a phone call no parent ever wants to hear. Elaine's tears fell in steady streams as she clutched her daughter's photo. Richard paced the corridor, fists clenched, voice rising as he demanded urgency. "Where is my daughter? Why haven't you found her?" "Eights." When they were finally allowed to see Tyler, his blood-stained shirt and vacant stare only deepened the fracture. Elaine rushed forward, sobbing, almost collapsing at the sight of him. Richard's eyes hardened, suspicion mixing with grief. Even before the investigation fully began, trust was unraveling between the people who had loved Madison most. By dawn, the story had spread beyond the walls of the station. Sacramento's local news outlets ran bold headlines. Teen girl missing after dance. Police suspect abduction. Madison's radiant photo, taken hours earlier in her emerald dress, now became a public plea. Television screens across the city broadcasted her face beside the words, "Missing, Madison Clark, age 17." The community's first reaction was swift. Flyers were printed overnight, stapled to telephone poles, plastered across store windows. Volunteers assembled, ready to comb through neighborhoods and river trails. But while citizens carried flashlights into the dark, investigators were carrying doubts back to the station. In their eyes, the case was not yet an abduction. It was a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Why no scream loud enough for others to hear? Why no witness to confirm the attacker? Why no clear footage from security cameras? Only a blurred figure moving behind the Corolla? For detectives used to concrete evidence, Tyler's testimony felt too fragile to lean on. Inside his mind, Tyler replayed the scene relentlessly. The scrape of Madison's heels, the silver glint of her necklace, the roughness of the hand that tore her away. He begged them to believe him, but his desperation only seemed to tighten the investigators' skepticism. The first day bled into the second. Officers canvassed the mall area, knocking on doors, questioning security guards, and combing through surveillance tapes frame by frame. They interviewed late-shift workers at nearby stores. Some remembered seeing a tall man in a greenish jacket weeks earlier, lingering by the lot, but none could pinpoint the night Madison vanished. Search dogs were deployed, noses pressed to the asphalt near the Corolla. They pulled toward Discovery Park, noses twitching with urgency. Dozens of officers and volunteers trudged through underbrush, shouting Madison's name into the morning air. Helicopters hovered above the Sacramento River, spotlights sweeping the water. But by nightfall, nothing concrete had been found. For the Clarks, those hours stretched like an eternity. Elaine sat clutching Madison's photo until her knuckles whitened, whispering prayers between sobs. Richard alternated between angry demands and silent stares. In the hallway of the station, he told an officer, "Every minute you waste doubting, she's farther away." Eights. The officer offered only a tired look in return. Psychologically, these first 48 hours planted seeds that would grow for years. Families of the missing often cling to hope, investigators cling to procedure, and communities cling to rumor. In Tyler's case, he carried a unique burden. He was both the only witness and the prime suspect. That duality would shape how people saw him for more than a decade. And yet, evidence from those very hours, the cigarette butt, the beer can, the prints, would someday crack open the silence. In the future, when investigators reopened the cold case files, they would find the DNA that turned suspicion into certainty. But in November 2007, that possibility felt distant, almost unimaginable. For now, all Sacramento had was a vanished girl, a distraught family, a shaken boyfriend, and a pile of fragments that refused to form a clear picture. If you've followed the story this far, you know how fragile truth can be in the first 48 hours. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you think videos like this help keep victims' stories alive, comment 1 below. If not, comment 0. Your voice matters, and it helps us decide which cold case files to bring forward next. By the second morning, Sacramento was already awake to a nightmare. The Ardon Fair Mall parking lot transformed into a temporary command center. Police cruisers lined the perimeter. Yellow tape cordoned off the Corolla's spot, and a white tent housed the first stacks of evidence. Radios crackled with orders as officers fanned out with clipboards and maps, while forensic teams combed every square foot of asphalt. Search dogs barked and strained against their leashes, pulling investigators toward the riverbank. Their noses pressed to the damp ground, following invisible trails into Discovery Park. Volunteers joined in waves, some still wearing work uniforms, others arriving with flashlights, sticks, and water bottles. They trudged along the wooded paths, calling Madison's name, their voices scattering into the morning air. Above, helicopters circled low, their spotlights cutting across the Sacramento River. Each sweep lit up water and shoreline for a brief moment before fading back into shadow. From a distance, the steady thrum of rotor blades sounded almost like a heartbeat for the entire city, restless, anxious, unwilling to stop. The Clarks stood near the command tent, faces pale from exhaustion, but unwilling to leave. Elaine clutched her daughter's photo against her chest, whispering prayers as volunteers streamed past. Richard spoke to anyone in uniform, his voice hoarse from repeating the same question. "Did you find anything?" Each shake of the head struck like another blow. In neighborhoods across Sacramento, posters appeared overnight. Madison's radiant homecoming photo, emerald dress gleaming, stared back from bus stops, telephone poles, and grocery store walls. The words, "Find Madison," "Bring her home," screamed in bold black letters. Teenagers skipped morning classes to staple flyers in clusters, their youthful faces hardened by grief. Psychologically, these early days of collective action mattered as much as evidence. For communities caught in sudden trauma, searching becomes ritual. Volunteers are not only looking for the missing, they are fighting the helplessness that shadows every corner. Lighting candles, chanting a name, stapling a flyer, each act is a way to hold chaos at bay. And if you've ever joined a search party, you know the paradox. Every rustle in the bushes makes your heart jump. Every false lead cuts it back down. Yet, you keep moving, because stopping feels like surrender. Forensic teams, meanwhile, worked meticulously, crouching near the Corolla with latex gloves snapping tight. They photographed the dented beer can, dusted it for prints, and sealed it in a labeled bag. The cigarette butt was collected in a sterile tube, its burnt tip still pungent. The bullet casing was pried carefully from the crack in the pavement, logged as item number 14. Every object was treated as if it held the entire case inside. Technicians also swabbed the door handles, lifted hair strands from the upholstery, and bagged the cracked Motorola phone. One lead tech muttered under his breath, "If we're lucky, the DNA will give us something." Yet in 2007, the technology was limited. Matching profiles often meant dead ends unless the suspect was already in a criminal database. Still, they preserved everything with a discipline that bordered on reverence. It was the only promise they could make. That time would not erase these fragments. By late afternoon, the first day's search came back empty. Volunteers returned with muddy shoes, tired eyes, and hands raw from pushing through brush. Some wept quietly in groups, while others patted Richard's shoulder in silent solidarity. Elaine stayed rooted in place, eyes fixed on the parking lot as though Madison might walk back at any moment. Hope in those hours was fragile but relentless. People held candles at the edge of the lot, forming a flickering ring of light against the encroaching dark. Reporters filmed the vigil, microphones catching choked voices. "Please, bring her home." Eights. Looking back years later, investigators would say these first community efforts created a foundation. They didn't solve the case in 2007, but they kept it alive. Without the posters, vigils, and relentless pressure, Madison's story might have faded like so many others. Instead, it stayed present, carried forward until technology could open the cold case files and pull truth from dust. For the Clark family, those days felt like moving through a storm without shelter. They were buoyed by the sight of hundreds searching for their daughter, yet devastated by every empty return. Elaine's voice cracked as she told a reporter, "She's out there somewhere. I can feel it. Please don't stop looking." Eights. The city didn't stop. Not yet. By the third day, pressure on Sacramento police intensified. The community's candlelight vigils and tireless searches had not produced answers, and the media was relentless. Every newscast opened with Madison's photo, her emerald dress now a symbol of fear, and anchors asked the same question. Who took her? Detectives scoured records of men known to loiter near Ardon Fair Mall. One name surfaced quickly, Gary Mendes, 32, arrested 2 years earlier for harassing women in the very same parking lots. He lived in a cramped apartment barely a mile away. Neighbors described him as a loner who drank heavily, stared too long at young women, and seemed to drift between odd jobs. On paper, he fit the narrative too well. Tall, lanky, unsettling presence, and no solid alibi on the night Madison vanished. When questioned, Gary muttered that he'd stayed home drinking beer and watching TV, so no witnesses, no corroboration. Suspicion snapped tight around him. One morning, before sunrise, police swarmed his apartment complex. Cameras caught the scene. Officers pounding on his door, Gary stumbling out in a stained shirt, eyes bloodshot, cuffs clicking shut. Within hours, headlines erupted. Suspect in Madison Clark, case detained. For the Clarks, the news brought a fragile thread of hope. Elaine wept when she heard. Richard squeezed her hand, whispering, "Maybe this is it. Maybe this time." Tyler, watching from afar, felt the weight on his shoulders ease, if only slightly. But suspicion and reality are often two different things. Inside the interrogation room, Gary was unpredictable, cooperative one moment, sneering the next. "I don't know who Madison is," he spat, voice rising. When police confronted him with his presence near Ardon Fair Mall, he shrugged. "So what? Everyone shops there." Eights. Still, investigators pushed forward. They urgently compared Gary's DNA with evidence from the cigarette butt, the beer can, and the smudge prints on the Corolla's door handle. Days passed in tense anticipation. Media outlets ran daily updates. Is Mendes the predator of Sacramento? Talk shows debated his guilt, with panelists pointing to his prior record as if it were enough to convict. And maybe you've seen it happen. When the public is starved for answers, they'll take a convenient suspect over an uncertain truth. Then came the blow. The DNA results were conclusive. None of the samples matched Gary Mendes. The fingerprints didn't align. The evidence from the parking lot cleared him entirely. At a press conference, the police chief's voice was low, almost apologetic. Gary Mendes is not connected to the disappearance of Madison Clark. We will pursue other leads. The announcement hit Sacramento like a cold wind. For Richard and Elaine, hope collapsed again. Richard sat silently in front of the TV, jaw clenched, while Elaine sobbed into her daughter's photo. "Why does it keep slipping away?" She cried. Tyler, once again under suspicion by whispers and headlines, felt the ground give way beneath him. The community reeled. People who had joined searches now murmured doubts. Was Tyler guilty after all? Or was the police force incapable of finding the truth? Anger spilled into editorials and late-night discussions. Headlines shifted. Mendes cleared. Case hits, dead end. The psychological toll was immense. The Clarks endured not just the pain of waiting, but the cruelty of speculation. Phone calls flooded their home, some with genuine tips, others with taunts. Elaine collapsed more than once, unable to bear strangers turning her daughter's disappearance into gossip. Richard grew gaunt, carrying the weight of helplessness and rage. For Tyler, the suspicion was suffocating. His friends whispered, his classmates questioned, and newspapers ran his name as the sole witness. He walked hallways with lowered eyes, guilt gnawing at him not only for failing to protect Madison, but for being painted as the villain in her story. The case, once burning hot, now cooled. The evidence remained boxed and labeled, awaiting technology that didn't yet exist. Investigators continued their work, but quietly, momentum drained. In hindsight, those days showed how fragile justice can be. Communities demand quick resolutions, but truth resists deadlines. And in this case, what began as a hopeful arrest only led to another page in the cold case files, a file that would grow heavier, thicker, and colder with every passing month. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told until justice is found, let me know. Comment 1 below if you think these videos matter, or 0 if you don't. Your voice helps decide which cold case files we bring into the light next. When the arrest of Gary Mendes collapsed, Sacramento was left with silence. Silence, and a wound that deepened with each unanswered day. For the Clark family, that silence turned into ritual. Every morning, Elaine brewed 2 cups of coffee, one for Richard, and one she set in front of Madison's framed photo on the kitchen table. It was her way of pretending her daughter's presence still lingered in the house. Richard, meanwhile, carried his pain differently. He sat for hours on the porch, staring down Whitney Avenue as though Madison might appear at the end of the street, walking home from school. Their house, once filled with teenage chatter and phone calls, became a mausoleum of memory. Madison's room remained untouched. The bed neatly made, the emerald dress hanging in the closet, notebooks scattered across the desk with unfinished history notes. As weeks turned into months, the community's energy waned. Posters faded in the rain, torn edges flapping in the wind. The hotline rang less often. New tragedies in California consumed the headlines, pushing Madison's case further down the news cycle. But Richard and Elaine refused to let the world forget. On November 10th, 2008, the one-year anniversary of Madison's abduction, they organized a candlelight vigil at a small plaza near Rio Americano High School. Over 300 people came. Classmates now 1 year older, teachers with somber faces, neighbors carrying flowers. In the cold November air, hundreds of candles flickered, their glow reflected in Elaine's tear-streaked eyes as she took the microphone. Her voice broke but held steady. It has been 1 year since Madison vanished. We don't know where she is, or if she is alive, but we will never stop looking. Please help us keep this light alive. Eights. Applause mixed with muffled sobs. Richard stood beside her, jaw tight, hand resting on her shoulder. Behind them, a poster-sized photo of Madison in her emerald dress shimmered in the candlelight, frozen in youth, eternally 17. The vigil offered comfort, but also sharpened the ache. The sight of candles swaying in the night reminded the Clarks of what they lacked. Their daughter's warmth, her voice, her future. For Tyler Brooks, standing quietly at the back, the event was equally bittersweet. He lit a candle and placed it among the others, then slipped away before cameras could find him. By then, he had transferred schools, unable to bear the whispers that followed him through Sacramento's hallways. To classmates, he was the boy who must have known more than he said. The stigma clung to him like smoke. Psychologically, guilt became his shadow. Though investigators had no evidence against him, Tyler carried the burden of being there, of being the last to see Madison alive. In his private journal, he wrote, "You were right there, and I couldn't save you." Eights. The candlelight vigil became an annual ritual. Each November, smaller crowds gathered at the plaza, but the Clarks never missed a year. Elaine always spoke, her trembling words a plea not just for her daughter, but for all missing children. Richard lit the first candle, his silent vow etched in flame. The ritual stitched meaning into their grief, transforming unbearable waiting into a kind of endurance. For the wider community, though, the stigma lingered. Some neighbors avoided the Clarks, as if tragedy were contagious. Others whispered cruel theories about Madison running away, about Tyler hiding the truth. These wounds cut deep, but they also forged resilience. The Clarks learned to live inside the duality of hope and despair, a fragile dance between believing Madison could come home and fearing she never would. By the end of that first year, the case file grew thicker with reports but thinner in leads. For Sacramento police, Madison Clark's disappearance was edging toward the inevitable shelf of unsolved mysteries. For the Clarks, every candle lit was a refusal to let her name sink into darkness. The city moved forward. The family stood still. As the months passed into years, the Clark family's fragile hope became a magnet, not only for compassion, but also for cruelty. The hotline set up for Madison's case began to ring with increasing frequency. At first, each call carried the possibility of salvation. A sighting at a bus station, a girl in a green dress near a convenience store, a young woman matching Madison's description walking through Reno, San Diego, or Las Vegas. Richard and Elaine drove countless miles, chasing shadows across Nevada highways and California beaches. Every time, the promise collapsed into nothing. A look-alike, a case of mistaken identity, a ghost in the crowd. Then the calls grew darker. An anonymous man insisted he knew where Madison was, demanding money before he would share details. When police traced the number, it was a disposable phone, untraceable, abandoned. Another caller taunted Elaine directly, saying, "I have her, but you'll never see her again." The cruelty drove Elaine to collapse in tears, throwing the phone down as Richard wrapped her trembling hands in his. If you've ever felt desperation, you know how a single sentence, even from a stranger, can twist hope into torment. That's what made the hoaxes so powerful. They were weapons disguised as leads. Investigators tried to filter genuine tips from hoaxes, but the volume overwhelmed them. Dozens of calls poured in weekly, some fabricated for the reward money, others made simply for the thrill of inflicting pain. Detectives warned the Clarks not to chase every rumor, but how could grieving parents resist even the faintest chance? Psychologically, the pattern was devastating. Each false lead created a cycle. Hope ignited, adrenaline surged, then the crushing collapse when reality intruded. Elaine once described it as being pulled from drowning water, only to be shoved under again. 8. Meanwhile, the media amplified every false lead. Headlines blared. Was Madison seen in Reno? Or Clark case moves to Las Vegas. When the stories proved false, coverage shifted to speculation about why people would lie, fueling more whispers, more doubt. Some viewers even began blaming the Clarks themselves, accusing them of being naive or desperate for attention. For Tyler Brooks, now living in Oregon, the false tips were knives that reopened his wound. Each headline dragged him back into suspicion. Online forums buzzed with cruel theories. Maybe Tyler knew more than he admitted. Maybe the false leads were distractions he created. He read them in silence, his heart pounding with rage and helplessness, knowing no denial could erase suspicion once it took root. By 2010, the Sacramento police chief admitted in a press conference, "We have followed dozens of leads across state lines. None have been verified. We urge the public to provide only substantiated information." But the plea did little. The cruel calls never stopped. The psychological toll was immeasurable. For the Clarks, hope became both lifeline and curse. For the police, every hoax drained resources. For the community, each false start eroded faith. And in the case file, the weight of lies piled atop truth, making the path forward even harder to see. In the end, all the false tips, all the fabricated stories, joined the growing archive of the cold case files, an echo of cruelty that scarred the family as deeply as the crime itself. Do you think telling these stories helps expose not only the crimes, but also the cruelty that surrounds them? Comment 1 if you believe videos like this matter, or 0 if you don't. Your feedback shapes which cold case files we bring back into the light. By early 2010, more than 2 years had passed since Madison Clark vanished from the Ardon Fair Mall parking lot. The investigation had expanded across state lines, chasing shadows in Nevada, Arizona, and Southern California, but nothing solid had emerged. Each lead dissolved into silence. Each false tip left deeper scars. Inside Sacramento's police headquarters, detectives gathered around a long conference table. Stacks of binders were piled high, their spines stamped with bold red labels. Clark, Madison, missing person, 2007. A lieutenant flipped through pages of interviews, maps, and forensic reports. The room was heavy with fatigue. Finally, the words came. "We have no clear suspects, no new evidence. We're transferring this case to cold status." 8. For the officers, it was a necessary formality. For the Clarks, it was betrayal. When Richard and Elaine were notified, Elaine collapsed into her husband's arms. Tears soaked his shirt as she sobbed. "They're giving up." Richard's jaw tightened, his silence more cutting than words. To them, cold case sounded like a death sentence, not just for Madison, but for truth itself. At a brief press conference, the police chief stood under fluorescent lights, stating, "This case will remain open under our cold case files unit, available for review when new evidence or technology arises." His words were careful, but the public heard something else. Closure without justice. The community's response was mixed. Some accepted the inevitability, comparing it to other unsolved California disappearances that had faded into history. Others were outraged, joining the Clarks at vigils to insist Madison not be forgotten. But over time, attendance dwindled. Where once hundreds lit candles, now only dozens stood in the cold. Psychologically, the transition to cold froze more than the case. It froze time for Madison's family. Elaine still brewed 2 cups of coffee every morning, one for her daughter. Richard still drove past the mall parking lot on weekends, staring at the spot where her car once stood. Their lives became a cycle of waiting, suspended between memory and despair. For Tyler Brooks, now in college out of state, the cold case label deepened his sense of exile. Though cleared of evidence, suspicion still lingered in whispers. He carried both survivors' guilt and stigma, believing that as long as the case stayed unsolved, so too would his life remain in shadow. By 2010, Madison Clark's story officially joined the shelves of Sacramento's cold case files, but for those who loved her, it never grew cold. Each candle lit at the plaza, each prayer whispered in the Clark household, was a vow that the truth would not be buried with the file. For nearly a decade, Madison Clark's file sat in the archives of Sacramento's cold case unit, a thick binder sealed in plastic, waiting for a future that might never come. But in 2019, science caught up with the silence. That year, the Sacramento Police Department began a collaboration with Othram, a pioneering forensic lab in Texas specializing in genetic genealogy. Their technology promised to do what 2007's DNA analysis could not: reconstruct degraded samples and compare them against vast public databases of ancestry profiles. It was a method that had already cracked other long-forgotten mysteries across America. For investigators who had nearly given up, it felt like a last lifeline. The evidence was pulled from storage with a kind of reverence. The dented beer can, the stubbed-out cigarette, the swabs from the Corolla's door handle, all preserved for 12 years in temperature-controlled vaults. Each item was sealed, logged, and shipped under tight security to Texas. For the Clarks, simply knowing the evidence was leaving its dusty shelf felt like a prayer answered. Technicians at Othram began by extracting microscopic traces of DNA from the cigarette and beer can. Using advanced sequencing, they were able to rebuild fragments into a usable profile. The first comparisons ran through CODIS, the National Criminal Database. Again, no hits. But this time, investigators had another option. GED Match, an open-source database where millions of Americans had uploaded DNA results from home ancestry kits. At first, the results were distant. Fourth and fifth cousins appeared on the screen, names scattered across the country. The analysts began building a family tree backward, linking branches through public records, census data, and obituaries. Slowly, a picture emerged. A cluster of relatives rooted in Sacramento County. The name that surfaced from the branches stopped investigators cold. Harrington. A surname common enough not to raise suspicion, but chilling in its proximity. The Harrington family had lived less than 10 minutes from Arden Fair Mall in 2007. Their records showed no serious criminal history, no glaring red flags. Yet every strand of genetic data pointed back to them. Inside Sacramento PD, the atmosphere shifted. After 12 years of dead ends, detectives found themselves staring at a tree that seemed to whisper the truth. One officer admitted, "I couldn't sleep that night. For years, we were blind. Now, suddenly, it was like the case was breathing again." A's. The Clarks were called in for a private meeting. Sitting across from detectives, Richard and Elaine listened as the science was explained in the careful, simple terms. The jargon barely mattered. What mattered was the phrase they'd been waiting over a decade to hear. "We have a new lead." Elaine's hands shook as she clutched Richard's. "At least there's still hope," she whispered. And if you've ever followed stories buried in the cold case files, you know the uncanny feeling when forgotten evidence suddenly lights up with new meaning. It's as though the past refuses to stay silent. Reporters caught wind of the breakthrough, publishing cautious headlines. "Clark case may see new life through DNA." The community stirred again, whispers rippling through neighborhoods once resigned to silence. Could it be true? Could science really expose what the human eye had missed for over a decade? Behind the scenes, investigators pored over every member of the Harrington family. Relatives had scattered to Oregon and Nevada, but one man stood out. Daniel Harrington, 47, still living in Carmichael, a short drive from the mall. Married, 2 sons, a steady job as an air conditioning repairman. To neighbors, he was ordinary, polite, helpful, church-going. That ordinariness was the most terrifying part. One detective muttered, "Sometimes the monster looks exactly like your neighbor." 8. Forensic genealogists confirmed the link. Daniel Harrington's DNA was a likely match for the profile lifted from the cigarette butt in 2007. What had once been rumor, hoaxes, and empty theories now solidified into scientific certainty. The Clarks lit a candle that night, as they had for years, but with a difference. This time the flame flickered with something stronger than ritual. The possibility that the man who had taken their daughter's future was finally within reach. Do you believe breakthroughs like this show why we should never give up on unsolved cases? Comment 1 if you think genetic genealogy is the future of justice, or 0 if you're not convinced. Your response helps decide which cold case files we bring back into the light. With Daniel Harrington's name emerging from the genetic family tree, Sacramento police knew they had to move with precision. Any misstep could tip him off, erasing the chance to confirm what the DNA already suggested. A surveillance team was dispatched to Carmichael. They rented an unmarked white van, its sides painted with a fake plumbing company logo, and parked discreetly on a quiet street just a few houses down. For weeks, detectives observed Harrington's routine. The early morning drives in his green work van, evenings at home with his wife and 2 teenage sons, Sunday mornings at church. Outwardly, he was the picture of suburban normalcy. But beneath the facade, investigators felt the chill of hidden truth. The key was to collect a fresh DNA sample, something legally discarded. They waited for the moment. On a Thursday night, Harrington rolled his garbage bin to the curb like every other neighbor. As his porch light flicked off and the house went silent, 2 plainclothes officers approached. In less than 30 seconds, they lifted bags from the bin into a sealed container and vanished into the surveillance van. Inside those trash bags lay the answer. Among crumpled soda cans and food wrappers, forensics recovered water bottles and several broken toothpicks streaked with saliva. Each item was sealed, logged, and rushed to the lab. The wait stretched over days, the entire team restless with anticipation. When the results finally arrived, the report spoke in absolute terms. DNA profile matches 100% with evidence collected at the Madison Clark crime scene, 2007. For detectives hardened by years of disappointment, the words hit like a thunderclap. There was no ambiguity now. The man living quietly among neighbors for 13 years had been at the parking lot the night Madison vanished. Plans for the arrest unfolded immediately. The chief ordered it to be swift, decisive, and safe for the community. At dawn on September 12th, 2020, police vehicles rolled silently into Harrington's neighborhood. Neighbors stepped onto porches, groggy and confused, as officers swarmed the modest white 1-story house. Harrington opened the door in a wrinkled t-shirt, eyes bleary. Within moments, he was forced to the lawn, handcuffs clicking around his wrists. His wife screamed from the doorway, sons frozen in shock. For a community that once saw him as a helpful neighbor and church-going father, the sight was surreal. The man who fixed their air conditioners now face down in the grass, accused of murder. News spread within the hour. Cameras swarmed Carmichael. Headlines erupted. Breaking: arrest in Madison Clark cold case. After 13 years, Sacramento finally had its suspect. Daniel Harrington's arrest sent shockwaves through Sacramento, but the case was far from finished. Investigators needed more than DNA. They needed his words. In the cold light of the interrogation room, Harrington sat across from detectives, wrists still marked from handcuffs. At first, he deflected, claiming he didn't even know who Madison Clark was. But when confronted with the evidence, the cigarette butt, the beer can, the DNA match from his trash, his composure faltered. His breathing quickened, eyes darting to the floor. Days passed before his silence cracked. On the 5th day, worn down by sleepless nights in a holding cell, Harrington muttered, "I was there that night. I pulled her away. I didn't mean to hurt her." His confession was halting, fragmented. He admitted carrying a gun, claiming it was only meant to scare her. He insisted the abduction spiraled out of control. When pressed about Madison's fate, his story shifted, blurry recollections of driving near Folsom Lake, of panic, of hiding her where he thought no one would ever find her. If you've ever followed a confession in a case buried in the cold case files, you know how chilling it is to hear a killer describe years of silence as if they were a fog he could hide inside. Guided by his vague directions, investigators moved quickly. Within 48 hours, a forensic team descended on a rugged canyon north of Folsom Lake. The search was grueling, boots crunching through brush and shovels cutting into earth. Then came the moment. A shout. Bones protruding from the soil, tangled with scraps of emerald green fabric. The same dress Madison had worn on homecoming night. Nearby, a silver heart-shaped necklace glinted in the dirt, her 16th birthday gift, returned after 13 years underground. The Clarks were notified in a hushed meeting. Elaine collapsed in Richard's arms, screaming as if the wound of 2007 had torn open all over again. Richard's eyes filled with tears, his grip tightening around her hand. "At least she's home now," he whispered, though the word home had never felt so heavy. The recovery electrified the case. Prosecutors now had DNA, a confession, and Madison's remains. At trial in the spring of 2021, the courtroom filled beyond capacity. The Clarks sat in the front row, hands clasped, faces pale but resolute. Tyler Brooks, once accused by whispers, testified in detail, his voice breaking as he recalled the night Madison was dragged from the car. His testimony mirrored Harrington's own confession, piece by piece. The defense tried to cast doubt, arguing memory after 13 years could be unreliable, suggesting Harrington had been pressured. But the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. Forensic experts testifying to the perfect DNA match, photographs of the excavated remains, the necklace, the dress fragment. Then the recording of Harrington's own words. "I was there. I pulled her away." 8. The jury deliberated for only a few hours. When they returned, the courtroom was silent enough to hear the shuffle of papers. The foreperson's voice rang out. "We find the defendant guilty of kidnapping and first-degree murder." 8. Elaine sobbed, clutching Richard's arm. Tyler lowered his head, tears streaking his face. Harrington sat expressionless as the judge sentenced him to life without parole. Outside, hundreds gathered with candles, chanting Madison's name. 13 years of grief ended not with joy, but with a verdict that finally named the guilty. Justice had come late, but it had come. For the Clarks, it was closure stitched with sorrow. Madison would never return, but her story would never again be lost to the shadows of the cold case files. In the fall of 2021, Madison Clark was finally laid to rest. The downtown cathedral filled with mourners, classmates now grown, neighbors who had once searched the woods, strangers who only knew her from posters. A white coffin draped in flowers bore a single object atop it. The silver heart-shaped necklace recovered from the canyon. Elaine and Richard Clark walked behind their daughter's casket, hands clasped, eyes hollow but resolute. Richard spoke softly at the pulpit. Justice came late, but it came. And for every child still missing, may their families never give up. His words echoed through the hall, a vow carried on by hundreds holding candles outside in the evening air. The story of Madison Clark is more than tragedy. It is a reminder. Justice may be delayed, but science, persistence, and memory can force open doors thought forever closed. The community's vigilance, the family's rituals, and the relentless progress of technology transformed silence into a verdict. And if you've ever wondered whether cases buried deep in the cold case files can still matter, Madison's story answers with a resounding yes. Her memory stands as both warning and hope. That darkness hides in ordinary places, and that no family's plea should fade with time. Before you go, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll continue shining light into the darkest corners and bringing long-forgotten cold case files back into the fight for justice.